Hello, so this will be a dissertation on the origins of the dying and rising god, particularly as the dying and rising god pertains to the mysteries, with a specific focus on Nabu and his or her connection to Antares, known as the heart of the scorpion, just beneath a fucus. As you can see here, a fucus who is recognized by Hippolytus of Rome, the early church father, in a video that I've already uploaded, as Christ, the Logos, specifically associated with Hermes, stands just above Scorpius, with Antares being the heart of the scorpion. And this is the star that in the astronomical compendium referred to as the Mulepin, which is just the Babylonian star charts. This is the star that is associated both with Lisi and Nabu, who are, for all intents and purposes, interchangeable deities. Now, the overall symbolism of this group of asterisms pertains to the Prometheus mythos. As you can see, a fucus would be Prometheus, with the serpent represented by the chains, or rather, the chains that bind Prometheus, represented by the serpent wound around a fucus's waist. You have Aquila, the eagle of Zeus, which is known to feed on the liver of Prometheus. You have Hercules, whom frees Prometheus by shooting Aquila with the arrow Sagitta, which is located right here in conjunction with Aquila. So this is very much so a depiction of the Prometheus mythos. Now, Libra was known as the claws of Scorpion in ancient times, and this is a memory still retained by the North and South stars, Zubanesh Kamali, Zubanesh Ganubi, Zubanel Ganubi, my mistake, which translates to the North and South claws. So this is to say that Libra, Scorpio, Scorpius, and Ophiuchus are all one constellation. You can absolutely identify different asterisms and separate them, but the symbolism here is all pertaining to the same story. One of the most one of the most famous depictions of Ophiuchus is as the Archangel Michael, who is often depicted as slaying the dragon, with Ophiuchus standing on the symbolic serpent or dragon or scorpion, and the scales that Saint Michael holds in his left hand being depicted right here, with Saint Michael stabbing down into the heart or mouth of the dragon. Perhaps the most well-known aspect is Ophiuchus as Asclepius, being the son of Apollo, or alternatively, even just as Apollo himself, wrestling with the python. But the connection with Asclepius, and by extension the Phoenician of Asclepius, known as Eshmun, will be the most prominent example that we come back to, perhaps the most crucial. So, admittedly, Nabu is not often recognized as a dying and rising god whatsoever. Nobody talks about this. I don't think I've seen anybody talk about this in modern day. But his association is not only well known to Assyriologists, he's speculated to be the hypostasis of the entire tradition. So this paper here, or this book, is authored by an individual named Stephen Herbert Langdon, who was the curator of the Babylonian section at the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania in the early 20th century. And he was the professor of Assyriology that replaced Archibald Sacchi, who I'm also going to be. I think he's going to pop up in some of these notes, at the very least, as an attributing or contributing scholar. A lot of these authors all coincide with one another, but the point here being that this is an esteemed Assyriologist saying this. Keep in mind that not all information has made its way into the mainstream world of academia in modern day. So when you come across information like this from the people who have worked hands-on with these things, it's important to realize that They're not randomly just making these exclamations for no reason. So here's what Stephen Langdon has to say about Nabu, Nesu, and Lyson. So after the multifarious activities of the earth goddess were apportioned to the three major types for Ma or Belith Ili was reserved in particular the protection and increase of animal life. She it was who, in the teaching of the great theological school of the cult of Enlil and Ninlil of Nippur, created man from clay, and her salient character is the goddess of childbirth. Under a minor form, as Gula, she became the patroness of medicine. Essentially an unmarried goddess, her minor types Bao, Gula, became wives of the sons of Enlil, Ningirsu, Ninurta, and Ereshkigal, as Ereshkigal, rather, became the wife of Nergal, son of Enlil. The official pantheon gives 41 names for Dingirma, among which the scribes indicate five as the most important. These are Ninma, mighty queen; Ninhursag, queen of the earth mountain; Nintur, dialectic center; queen, the womb; Ninmea, or Nunusamea, the queen who allots the fates; and Ninsakila, the pure queen. On the note of Ninsakila, as regards Lysi, or Lyson, as we've already seen in the Babylonian Mulepin, the star charts, Lyson and Nabu are both directly associated with Antares. Typically, Lyson is treated as a distinct deity whose spouse was known as Ninsakila. So Ninsakila here is listed as the pure queen, but it's also known that Ninsakila was sometimes known as a male figure, whereas Lyson, here referred to as a male, was often referred to as a female later on. It's a little confusing in that aspect, but it's important in its own right because what it's actually signifying here is that we're looking at two aspects of one being. Okay, this is Cadmus and Harmonia. So, and you'll see that here in a second. Under the last title, right, Ninsakila, the pure queen, she was wife of her son Nesu, dialectic Lisi. The god Nesu is known almost entirely by his star Antares in Scorpio, which was also identified with Nebo. Among other titles which appear in the myths are Aruru, Nintud, meaning the queen who bears; Amatuda, the bearing mother; Amdubad, the mother who opens the lap or womb; and Mama or Mami. It is extraordinary that the theological lists give her a husband by name Shulpe, in reality a name of Marduk as the planet Jupiter. Every city had a temple, usually named Ima, or at least a shrine to this goddess, but her principal cult centers were at Dab and Kesh in southern Sumer and at Kish near Babylon. Okay, so it goes into more detail about her descriptions, her worship, describes the creation of the world. But what this ultimately goes on to say is that Lysin is the mother goddess who creates the dying sun, acts as the consort and mother. Continuing here, we have the myth of the mother goddess and her son and husband, who died yearly and descended for a time to the underworld to be rescued and restored to his wife and mother, generally appears in Sumerian and especially Babylonian religion, at Erech and the cult of Anini and Dumuzi, Ishtar and Tammuz, but the older form of this myth in Sumerian seems to have been associated with the cult of Nintur, Ninhursag, and Aruru, which are all the same names of Lyson, right? Uh, Epithets, effectively, and her son and husband Nesu. Okay, so again, the significance here, because as I've said, or as I started with, Nabu is not often associated, or ever. I don't think I've seen anybody in modern day associate Nabu whatsoever with the myth of the dying and rising god. But the funny part is that he is literally regarded as the hypostasis of the entire fucking tradition. So one more time, the myth of the mother goddess and her son and husband, who died yearly and descended for a time to the underworld to be rescued and restored to his wife and mother, generally appears in Sumerian and especially Babylonian religion, at Erech and the cult of Anini and Dumuzi, Ishtar and Tammuz. But the older form of this myth, in Sumerian, seems to have been associated with the cult of Nintur, Ninhursag, Aruru, and her son and husband, Nesu. One one particularly important aspect or association, how I said Cadmus and Harmonia, right? An Assyrian text describes her as follows. The head has a turban, and she is provided with knots on the turban, like earth flies, bands on the waist, yada, yada, yada. We're going to skip down to here. From her waistband to the soles, she is covered with scales like a serpent. And that's how you end up with this depiction right here, Cadmus and Harmonia, right? Half serpent woman, the mother goddess, whose consort is Hermes. So that's what Cadmus was. He was said to have brought the Phoenician alphabet to the Greeks. He was a Phoenician prince who was transformed into a snake. Okay, so this is your celestial, this is a fucus, is what we're looking at here, which comes back to the worship of the mother goddess and her son and consort. You probably recognize this in modern day, right? This is the modern day version of it. Now, here's a part of her mythos that is of Lysi or Lysin, this mother goddess figure that pertains directly or relates directly to the 14 pieces of Osiris, right, and his dismemberment by the gods, additionally connecting them to Dionysus and his dismemberment by the Titans, and to Saint George, who in the Arabian mythology shares a, shares a story where he's dismembered into 14 pieces and reassembled again. So, quote, all the lands were sea. When the interior of the sea was a well, then Eridu was made and Isagila created. Isagila, which in the deep the king of the holy chamber inhabited. Babylon was made and Isagila completed. The gods, the Anunnaki, together made them. The holy city they named abode of the joy of their hearts. Marduk assembled wickerwork on the face of the waters. He created dust and heaped it up with the wickerwork, to cause the gods to dwell in the abode of the joy of their hearts. Mankind he created. Aruru with him created the seed of mankind. This is the late Babylonian version of creation, in which Marduk replaces Enki or Ea, who is often seen as Prometheus. In a myth of the destruction of mankind. So what this is Prometheus and his wife. In a myth of the destruction of mankind by drought, famine, and pestilence, or actually more accurately, the feminine and male aspects of them. It was Mami who recreated men from clay at the command of Ea, keeping in mind that every time you say mom or mommy in modern day, it's a direct reference to this mother goddess from the ancient Sumerian pantheon. She is here called Mother Womb, creatress of destiny. Having uttered an incantation over clay, she placed 7 pieces of clay at her right hand and 7 at her left. Between them she put a baked brick. These became 7, and 7 childbearing wombs. 7 creating males and 7 creating females. She designed them in her own likeness. The significance here being the recurrent group of like 7 sages or 7 virtuous spirits, like the Amesha Spinta from out of Zoroastrianism, the 7 Apkallu, the 7 Sabeti, like the sons of Enmeshara, uh, the Corybantis. Sometimes some of these numbers vary, don't get me wrong, but it is very much a fact that 7, with usually like an eighth hidden figure, is a recurrent theme. So here it says that she created 7 and 7, and that too shows itself. You usually have the antithesis of the 7 virtuous beings. So, for instance, in Zoroastrianism, rather, you have the 7 Amesha, but you also have 7 evil versions of these spirits to offset the Amesha, or at least I'm pretty sure that's the case in Zoroastrianism. It might just be Ahriman that ends up opposing them, but I'm pretty sure that they have like the 7 evil versions. In Christianity, you'd have like the 7 archangels, and then you'd have like the 7 cardinal sins. You see what I mean? In Kabbalah, this is reflected by the 7 Sephirot, or it's not 7, right? But the positive Sephirot and the negative Klipoth, which oppose all of those virtuous principles, with the Sephirot standing in as the representation of those virtuous principles. But what this should go to show is that overall, this Ophiuchus and Scorpius and Libra and Hercules symbolism, right, is not only associated with the dying and rising God or Christ specifically by Hippolytus and authors such as him, like the early church fathers, but it's also directly known or directly related to these ancient traditions as far back as Sumer. Now, there's a lot to jump into. So, here you might notice that the celestial ecliptic, which is the route that the sun travels through the sky, is seen to intersect with the celestial river that is the Milky Way. Now, I've said before that Antares is associated with Moses. I've talked about this a decent bit, and seeing that Moses was directly influenced by Nabu. I have multiple videos on that. I made quite the case for it. I would recommend watching them if you don't understand those connections, but I will elucidate upon it here a bit more. So, the ecliptic can be seen to intersect with the celestial river that is the Milky Way. And this is reflected in the Platonic, rather, this is an extension of Neoplatonism, wherein the Platonic ideal was that this intersection between Ophiuchus and Sagittarius here, and then opposite, um, the intersection between Gemini and Taurus, right, where the Milky Way also crosses right here between Taurus and Gemini. This is your X shape. This is the tau or the cross associated with the astrotheological portion, which is the entirety of this tradition, right? It's astrotheological by nature. So Macrobius, referencing this tradition, gives an incorrect association. I can't remember if he said which constellations he had said in particular, but this actually gets corrected. As you can see here, for instance, in the Mithraic, or coming down a bit more, in his commentary on the Dream of Scipio, Macrobius locates the gates of the afterlife at the intersections of the Milky Way and the Zodiac. And these intersections actually occur on one side between Taurus and Gemini, as we just looked at, and at the opposite location between Scorpius and Sagittarius, as we just saw. Right? So we've just confirmed this to be true. So whatever constellations Macrobius had attributed them to is incorrect, indicating a parallel between the Babylonian Gilgamesh myth and later Neoplatonist eschatological exegesis, which is to say, the Abrahamic tradition. And it's well known that that X symbol is a deeply entrenched piece of symbolism within the mysteries. So here, in a work authored by Jacques Chevalier, this section being Alpha and Omega, the overall work being a postmodern revelation, he specifically makes mention to Ezekiel 9. He states, Nebo appears as a scribe dressed in white. Now keep in mind, the actual translations that have made it to us do not specifically say Nebo, but they do describe this entire event as it's described here. So Nebo appears as a scribe dressed in white and leader of seven spirits, an imagery echoed by the Son of Man and John. The scribe places a cross on the foreheads of the elect, right? That's your Tau symbol, thereby marking and protecting the faithful remnant of Israel. The gesture is reminiscent of the Passover story of the blood of the Paschal Lamb, placed on the lintel of a house to save the household from the angel of death, a story commemorated at the beginning of spring in the first month of Nisan. John is now applying the springtime crossmark and reading of the Book of Destiny imagery to the seven-starred Passover Lamb and Lord of Easter Sunday. So ultimately, what this is, why I'm mentioning this, is because this recurrence of these seven spirits that Nebo's listed as leading here, and how I told you already about Lyson, or the mother goddess, whatever name you want to call her, and her association with these spirits. This is the most common attribution. If you were to go on Wikipedia and look, it'll tell you that Lyson was the mother of 8 children, yada, yada, yada. Okay. So we know that it is, in fact, Nebo leading the spirits because of what we've already established here. But Ophiuchus is Eshman. Like, that is the overall symbolism, right? It's just one more face of the dying and rising god. It's Eshman. All right, so to better understand this, and I'm going to make it very easy to understand right off the bat. This is a what this all goes to demonstrate is that Hermes, or the Logos, is basically the underlying character of all of these treatments. That's what it's going to come back to, as you'll see. So this is from The Origin of Pagan Idolatry by Stanley Faber. And what he has to say is that the identity of Attis and Adonis will be shown in a yet stronger light if we once more return to Phoenicia. We there find a deity worshipped by the Greeks and Romans under the name of Asclepius or Asclepius, respecting whom a story is told, which blends together the fables of these two gods, and thus, while it proves them to be mutually the same, proves also that they are each the same as Asclepius. According to Sanchuniathon, Sanchuniathon was an author mentioned by Philo of Byblus. It's his works that Philo is referencing near like 60, the turn of the millennium, like 60 BC or something like that was Philo's birthday. So Philo is said to be referencing Sanchuniathon from prior to the time of the Trojan War, so about 13th century BC or prior. According to Sanchuniathon, Sadiq, or the just man, who is clearly the patriarch Noah, was the father of the seven Cabiri, who were the builders of the first ship, or the ship Argo, right? Because these are the seven creating gods who decree fate, as they did in Sumer. These are the gods of the mysteries. These are the same ones that are always worshipped all over the place. So Patriarch Noah, known as Sadiq, or the just man, Sadiq, Melchizedek, right? Melchizedek literally just meaning my king is Sadiq, or my king is just, right? So Sadiq, or the just man, who is clearly the patriarch Noah, was the father of the seven Kabiri, who were the builders of the first ship, or the ship Argo. And to them an eighth brother was added, thence denominated Esmuni, but properly called Asclepius. Respecting him, Damascus relates that although worshipped by the Greeks, he was really neither Greek nor Egyptian, but a Phoenician god, peculiarly adored at Berytus, or the city of Beris, where the Cabiri had consecrated the relics of the ocean, or the deluge. That he was a youth of such beauty as to engage the affections of the goddess Astrone, the mother of the gods, and that finding himself perpetually followed by her while engaged in the chase, he at length, to avoid her importunities, castrated himself with a hatchet. Everything in this legend combines to show that Asclepius is the same as the emasculated or hermaphroditic Attis or Adonis, keeping in mind that hermaphrodite is literally a term based on the god known as Hermaphrodite, which was the son of Hermes and Aphrodite, right? So hermaphrodite, Attis and Adonis, and that Astrone or Astereth is the same as Venus and Cybele. Hence it will follow that he is a Diluvian god, and the whole of his mythological history will confirm the opinion. If you're not familiar with, I do not mean to insult anybody's intelligence by any means. If you're not familiar with Diluvian, it means that he's a god related to the flood, right? Keeping in mind that versions of the flood myth that obviously predate the fucking Bible exist all over the world, not the least of which being Atrahasis from the Akkadians, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the Sumerian Kings list, so on and so forth. Okay. He was the great healer and restorer of the human race. And in his astronomical character of the sun, he was worshipped in conjunction with Salus, or the moon. For the lunar boat was a symbol of that ark, which afforded health or safety to the Noetic family. He was curiously connected with both the dove and the raven, which are introduced so conspicuously into the Mosaical account of the flood. Now, keep in mind, this god that we're referencing here, Eshman, one of the readings of his name, it was either his name or an epithet of his. I just read this yesterday, that a legitimate translation of it or meaning of it is as the Holy Spirit. like directly. So there's your dove, and the raven is the messenger part, right? The Hermes part, the logos. It's the prophet. Okay, so which are introduced so conspicuously into the Mosaical account of the flood. He was thought to have returned from the infernal regions and to have possessed the power of bringing back others from the same place. That is to say, he was supposed, like Osiris and Adonis, to have died and to have been revived. And he was one of the navigators of the ship Argo, which was also the ship of Beris, or sorry, the ship or Beris of Osiris, and which is the same as the Argo that safely conveyed the Indian Shiva over the waters of the deluge. In reference to this part of his character, his temple at Rome was built on an island of the Tiber, and the island itself, which seems to have been commensurate with the temple in point of size, was curiously fashioned with a breastwork of marble into the form of a ship, the higher part of it imitating the stern and the lower part the prow. The shape which this god I always struggle with this word, peculiarly delighted to assume was that of a serpent. But the serpent was one of the chief emblems of the Great Father in every quarter of the globe. Thus, Macrobius tells us that a serpent was subjoined to the statues of Asclepius and Salus, considered as the sun and moon. Of these, the Orphic poet invokes the former by the name of the Savior and celebrates the latter as the universal queen and great mother of all. Then he goes on to say, we are assured by Clemens Alexandrius that Attis, who we just connected with Eshman, was the same as Bacchus or Dionysus, and by Macrobius that Attis, Osiris, Adonis, and Bacchus were all one deity. Now, we're going to bring it back to Antares, okay, because this connection to Mars, remember, Antares meaning equal to Mars, equal to, okay, not opposed to, equal to Mars, is very significant. Okay, so the ancient mythologists of all nations are unanimous in asserting that each of their chief masculine deities is equally the sun, and thence they no less explicitly than consistently maintain that all of these deities, though apparently distinct, are fundamentally one and the same. Their testimony therefore sufficiently establishes what may be called the astronomical or celestial character of the pagan hero gods. I'm going to speed this up a little bit because I've been reading for a while, and I've had to try to record this several times. Thus, to descend to particulars, Saturn or Cronus is declared to be the sun by Macrobius and Nonus. Jupiter is said to be the sun by Macrobius, Nonus, and the author of the poems which bear the name of Orpheus. Pluto or Danaus is said to be the sun by the Orphic poet, and this position also follows also from his declared identity with other deities who are avowedly the sun. So well indeed was it established that Eusebius asks in astonishment on what grounds Pluto and Serapis, who were one and the same infernal deity, could yet be identified with the solar orb. Bacchus or Dionysus is represented as the sun by Virgil, Ausonius, Macrobius, Sophocles, and the Orphic poet. Priapus is said to be the sun by the Orphic poet, who identifies him with Protagoras and Dionysus. That Apollo is the sun. Yet, obviously, there's all the references. Janus is said to be the sun by Macrobius. Pan or Phanes is also said to be the sun by Macrobius and the Orphic poet. Hercules is said to be the sun by Nonus and Macrobius. Vulcan or Hephaestus is said to be the sun by the Orphic poet. The Egyptians called him Ta and Amun or Amon and esteemed him as the same as Osiris, who they professedly venerated as the sun. Asclepius or Asclepius is said to be the sun by Macrobius. This opinion was so fully recognized by his worshippers that Eusebius ridicules it as a well-known absurdity, on the ground that he is made the offspring of Apollo, who himself is also the sun. Such, however, was the constant arrangement of the genealogies of the pagan gods. The same deity is perpetually represented under the twofold relation of son and father, according as he was viewed under different aspects. Mercury or Hermes. All right, I'm gonna slow down here because this is where it's gonna come back to Antares and why Nabu is associated with Antares. Oh, and as a side note, keep in mind that Nabu's name, although not often recognized, an official, legitimate understanding of his name is to mean shining or bright, right? So there's your solar aspect. As I've shown before, he was directly syncretized with Apollo. I mean, that's really what you should be getting from all this, right? So Mercury or Hermes is said to be the sun by Macrobius. Oh, and Antares' helical rising in modern day is currently on Christmas, which is known as the birth of Christ. So Mercury or Hermes is said to be the sun by Macrobius, and by the Orphic poet he is declared to be the same as Bacchus, who is similarly pronounced to be the sun. This deity was the Hermanubis or Thoth or Tot of the Egyptians and Phoenicians, who was reckoned the same as Cronus or the sun. He was also the Tautes of the Celts, the Tuisto of the Goths, and the Twashta or Tot or Data of the Hindus. Tot is the same as Buddha or Sakya, and Buddha again is ultimately allowed to be Surya of the sun. Tus, Tooth, or Toth was likewise a name of Mars or Ares. Hence, Macrobius joins the god of war with Mercury, Antares, and declares him to be equally the sun. The warrior Mercury was the Woden or Wood of the Scythic tribes, and Wud or Bud was the same as the Indo-Scythic Buddha, whose worship was brought from Asia into Europe by the Gothic immigrants. From Kashgar and Bokhara, Ares or Hares was among the Eastern nations a title of the sun, and Mars, as the Latins compoundedly expressed in the word, is but Ma Ares or the Great Ares. As Mars, from his identity with the solar Tauta Mercury, was called Tus Ares, so Dionysus bore the kindred appellation of Dus Ares. Each of these names is Toth Ares or Toth the sun, and it may be observed that from Toth or tooth the Greeks borrowed their word tous as the Latins did their deus, which they severally used by way of eminence to denote the godhead. Our English word God has been taken from another appellation of the same deity. God, God, Gautama, Gautama are varied titles of Wud or Buddha, and Buddha is the same as Toth or Hermes. Osiris, Horus, and Serapis are each said to be the sun by Diodorus, Siculus, Macrobius, Eusebius, an ancient oracle of Apollo, and the author of the Horapline hieroglyphics. Belus or Baal is said to be the sun by Nonus. Baal is a mere title denoting Lord, just as Moloch signifies king. Yeah, this happens really often, where people in modern day, it's like we've been taught to refer to these gods by like epithets, because Baal is just an epithet, right? Adonis is just an epithet. Nabu is just an epithet. Okay, so anyway, Baal is a mere title, just as Moloch signifies king. And Baal and Moloch were clearly names of the same solar god. The former is variously compounded, in allusion to the various attributes of the deity who is known by it. So ultimately, it's just going to say this is all the same thing. And that's something that pretty much anybody who studies the mysteries already knows, right? It's only really people that adhere to mainstream religions that don't want to accept this type of stuff, even though it's clearly all over the place. And even though ancient authors clearly discuss it all the fucking time, they don't want to recognize these things. So as I said, Antares' helical rising is on Christmas, December 25th. Now you understand the Aries connection and why Hermes and Aries are paired up. But an interesting note from the Tablet of the 30 Stars, the remarks by June Brown. This is Society of Biblical Archaeology, but Tablet of the 30 Stars. Um, what he says here, the importance we may gather from the Saints Calendar Tablet translated by Professor Seishi, and I think I mentioned him earlier. That was Archibald Seishi, the professor of Assyriology that Stephen Herbert Langdon replaced, the guy who gave us this work, Mythology of All Races, where we found that information about Nesu as the hypostasis, the dying and rising god, which is Nabu. The 25th day is the processional day of Bel and Beltis of Babylon, a lucky day. In the night, the king presents his free will offering to Bel before the star of the foundation. The winter solstice was a natural commencement of the year, yada, yada, yada. So again, though, what we have here is a direct reference to the 25th day as the processional day of Bel or Baal. And that's one of the, I've never seen that one mentioned anywhere else either. I've seen people talk about Cronia and Cachelia and Saturnalia and Brumalia, but I've never seen anybody talk about the processional day of Bel. Right? So there you go, right from the professor of Assyriology, Archibald Seishi, on the remarks of the Tablet of the 30 Stars. But I guarantee you, some Christian apologist like Wes Huff would look at it and somehow find a way to fucking deny it because he's a bona fide retard. Pertaining to Moses, um, tie this back into him real quick. So here you have Antares, star 23, known as the star, the hero, the king, Kab Masu Sar, right? Masu, Moses, Mars, the Lord of the Seed, and the month Tishri, the lusty king. A couple of other important things to realize is that this next couple bit is all talking about a fucus and serpent serpens. So it's just talking about a fucus. And so the star man of death, the corpse, the fever, this they attribute to the hand of a fucus. This is just talking about a fucus. The man of death, the corpse, the fever. It's the dying and rising god. Star number 25, and this is directly, they call it star, but it's interchangeable with asterism. This is directly referencing the snake that a fucus holds, the star of the snake. It is known as the goddess queen of the great region and Nebo and the king, right? This is the same star. 25, 26. So this right here is all in reference to the snake, which is known both as the goddess queen of the great region, yeah, and Nebo and the king, the sun god and the air god. Remember that Nabu translates also to brighter shining, right? The sun god and the air god. And as I've stated prior elsewhere, during the Parthian period around 200 BC, something that you can still find online, the ruins of Nimrod Dak. There's monumental carvings made out to the syncretized figure of Mithra, Helios, Apollo, Hermes. And if you look at Mithridates, the first his Wikipedia page, I believe it's Mithridates the first or sixth. That's where you'll find a reference directly stating that Nabu, Apollo, and Mithra were all directly syncretized, which makes sense because Mithra's name means love, right? Meher, love. It's the religion of love. That's what all of this is. And that's why you have Nabu in Mandaism, which was one of the oldest Gnostic sects of Christianity, still recognized today, right? They're still active today. That's why you have in their official biblical texts, they say they allotted wisdom for Nabu and made him the Lord of love. Man, they associate Nabu directly with Jesus. Now, I think they say Jesus is a false prophet. It's beside the point, right? It's beside the point. They directly associate Nabu with Jesus and call him the Lord of love. Okay. That's literally what Mithra's name means, is love. It's not an accidental connection. It's an underlying tradition. The asterism that is composed of a crab and Deshuba and one other, it's three stars, but it's the head of Scorpion, of the Scorpion, so of Scorpio. So still within a fucus, right? But it is known specifically as Kakab Gisgan Gusir Kaku Sa DP the star of the tree, light of the hero, weapon of Ea, Enki, and Prometheus, which in the midst of the abyss he placed, the falchion, the weapon of the hand of Merodach. Right? And they go on to discuss this being Gisgangusir might be read the tree in the garden of light. This radiant tree is further described as being a weapon of the gods Ea and Merodach, tree placed in the midst of the abyss, and it is impossible to avoid comparing it with the tree of life placed in the midst of the biblical Garden of Eden. Okay, so there's your Garden of Eden connection. The star of the tree, light of the hero, as if it were a torch. And in the Hindu nakshatras, this asterism, the same one that they're talking about here, the same three stars, correspond directly to the Anurhada, or 16th nakshatra, Antares being the 17th. And the Anurhada nakshatra is ruled over by Mitra. So I've certainly stated it elsewhere, stated again here if I haven't already, that this Milky Way band right here seems to be the inspiration for the crossing of the Red Sea. Right? You can never quite determine which one inspired which first. I mean, obviously, this isn't changing anytime soon. So I would imagine that this must have been considering the association with Antares and Moses, as I'll retouch upon here in a second. I believe that this is the crossing of the Red Sea. Okay. So returning to that connection between Moses and Antares, so it's all in one place. R. Brown, June, FSA, Tablet of the 30 Stars, which we were just looking at. Regulus, but this paper of Mr. Brown's shows that the name Masu the king was also given to the star called by Ptolemy Antares, and we already confirmed that, or equal to Aries or Mars, which is the center of three bright stars in Scorpio, called the core or heart of Scorpio. This star is in the tablet of the 30 stars called the star of the Lord of the Seed, the month Tishri, following the month called in the Hindu calendar Badan, Bhadrapada. Beginning with the autumnal equinox, the father month of the year of the barley growing races, who in Antioch mourned the death of the old year Tammuz and rejoiced over his new one, over the birth of the new one, on the date answering to the first Tishri. I have shown in Essay 3 the connection between Moses, the Etruscan Mas, and the Latin Mars, and this star Masu in Scorpion, which is by Ptolemy compared to Mars, is said to be is said in the tablet of the 30 stars to be consecrated. Yada yada yada. This newborn race was nourished by the crops grown by the barley growing race, whose guiding star was Masu or Moses, right? Which seems to fit in nicely with my claim that this represents the crossing of the Red Sea. Now, interestingly, there's also a connection to a couple of other characters, but in a strangely roundabout way. So there's a direct connection between Antares and Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata, but there's a connection to Eshmin, aside from the fact that Scorpio is already part of Ophiuchus, right? And the obvious imagery of Ophiuchus and Eshmin. There's yet another connection between these two. So this is from James Francis Hewitt Catharinas. He works hand in hand with Robert Brown and Archibald Sachy and all of the other individuals, Herman Hunger and all these individuals that were working on these papers we've been going over. So here it's going to be a bit more context on those creative spirits that this all seems to revolve around, along with the dying and rising god as the head of them. So they there learn to revere the eight Agnis or fire gods. Here, I'll give a bit more. I'll give a bit more context. It was in this wetland and in their original motherland of Asia Minor that they first, as the Hindu Turvasu, the people whose god Vasu is the Tur or pole, learned the religion, and this directly goes back to Lyson, learned the religion which they brought with them first to the Persian Gulf and afterwards to the Syrian coast, close to the land from which they first started on their land wanderings in the wilderness. Before we go on there, right? Tur, as I said, related to Lyson. Let's see that connection. So back on the mythology of all races, it is perhaps a coincidence that the ancient pictograph for Tur consists of the pictures for right and left hand. Remember that creation story with Lyson and the right and left hands and the seven pieces each, right? And that Nintur equals Mami created men from pieces of clay at her right and left hand. The sign Tur certainly means bearing woman Nintur, queen of the womb, and the same sign developed to form red Lil, feeble, decrepit. Also the word for man, Lil, Akkadian Lilu, Lulu, who was created from clay by this goddess. That's another name for Nesu or Nabu. It's the dying and rising god, right? The same sign has the meaning ill, pain, sickness, Tur, and her son, the dying god, is described in one hymn as Mululil, the feeble one. It seems then that the most ancient titles of this goddess refer to her having created man, and to her having borne the dying god. Man, the mortal one, whose lifeblood and flesh spring from the god himself, walks forever in the shadow of death, as does his divine brother, the god Lil, or Nesu. Now then, whose people or whose god, Vasu, is the Tur or pole, right? Learned the religion which they brought with them, first to the Persian Gulf and afterwards to the Syrian coast, close to the land from which they first started on their land wanderings in the wilderness. They there learned to revere the eight Agnis or fire gods, the father gods of the eight tribes of Gans, the people who, as the sons of the wild cow Gwari, the mother of the Hindu Gans and of the Euphratean Gwarian race of Tello, the ancient Girsu, ruled the seven kingdoms of the Indian Kushika. Yada, yada, yada. These eight Agnis became the eight creating gods of Egyptian mythology, who first as the six and afterwards as eight creating apes of the eastern Greenland of Tinu, called Bintet and Keftenu, or the Phoenician apes, became in a later age, the four male and four female creating spirits, headed by Nun, the fish god, the spirit of life, concealed in the life-giving mist. These eight creating gods were those worshipped as the eight Cabiri in Phoenicia and Thrace, who were as stars, the seven greats, or sorry, the seven stars of the Great Bear and the polar star, the Tuer. This last was the god called Eshmin, and the youngest of the sons of Sadiq, the just, the father of the gods of the Phoenician Kabiri, and Sadiq or Sudik. Keep in mind that the just, will come back to a function of Nabu. The father of the gods of the Phoenician Kabiri, and Sadiq or Sudik was the revered Dag Su, soul of life, sap of life, the root of the Hindu Soma, the Sind Homa, the southern form of the northern bird Ku. Eshmin, the pole star, was the eight-rayed star, called by the Akkadians An, meaning God or Esha, the soul or bird Shu of life, Esh, the seed, and depicted as the ideograph of the seed and God in the Gersa inscriptions. It was in the eighth Maherta, consecrated to these eight gods, of whom the eighth was the polar star Vega, the firm star, the pillar of the stars, that Yudhishthira, meaning the most steadfast, was born, and it is to his birth we must now return. His birthday was on the 5th of the light fortnight of Kartika, the 8th month, another appearance of the sacred number 8, under the star Jayestha. This star is, in the list of nakshatras, Antares, Scorpio, and it is one of the stars called by the Babylonians Masu. Okay, so let's see a bit more about the tour. It is in the cosmogony of the Akkadian star worshippers consecrated to the star Antares, Alpha Scorpionus, which is called in the tablet of the 30 stars, the Lord of Seed in the month Tisri. This is the star of Dan, the judge, right? The just and the judge. Again, keep these in mind. He's going to come back to Nabu. And therefore of his sons, the Hindu Danava, the Greek Danoe, the Zindan Akkadian Turanian sons of Danu, for it is he who in ancient mythology was the goat god Uz or Asau, who watched the revolutions of the solar disk on the Babylonian monuments. He was the father of the Hittites, who holds this, and this is a different interpretation of the stone of Nebuchadnezzar. I think it is that, I'm pretty sure it's the stone of Nebuchadnezzar that depicts like three figures approaching like the sun on a table in front of this great god. He was the father of the Hittites, who holds the staff of empire, the goat-headed scepter of Osiris, the goat and ram god, the rod of Rhadamanthus, the Greek judge and diviner, by the rod, the axial pole of the cross of St. George, which was also the road running from north to south. This was the cardo, the pivot axis of the world. Okay, so they're talking about the Tur as the pole star, the pivot axis of the world, the cardo, right? Keeping in mind that biblical Dan is seen or depicted carrying the caduceus, right? The same as Asclepius. Well, I guess in this instance, it's closer to the rod of Asclepius, really. Yeah, it's not necessarily a caduceus. That's more so. Yeah. Um. So there's your Asclepius connection, and all of the other ones that come along with it, right? Now, Yudhishthira, right, being born under Antares, Yudhishthira is specifically, he is the main protagonist of the Mahabharata, right? He is the eldest of the Pandava brothers, cousins of the Kauravas, who they go to war with. That's the entire story of the Mahabharata, is that Yudhishthira loses his kingdom, is your prodigal son aspect, um, and then he undergoes 13 years of exile in the wilderness. There's your exile in the wilderness aspect. There's your number 13 pertaining back to like the Epiphany and the 13 days after Christmas when Christ is born. And Yudhishthira has to go to war again, ultimately against his cousins, so that he can reclaim his kingdom, what is rightfully his. He ends up, he's associated with honesty, he's associated with justice. He saves his brothers from the underworld, descends down there, answers questions, brings them back from Naraka, which is their version of hell. He ends up ascending to heaven. He's the only demigod. He's the son of Yama, or Yima, which is literally the embodiment of Dharma. So he is the son of like the judge of the underworld. So there's this recurrent theme with judge and justiceness, right? Because Eshman, the son of Sadiq, the just, right? So I told you this was going to come back to Nabu. Now, this is a paper called, or a book called Who is Hiram Abiff? And this is written by John Sebastian Marlowe Ward from out of the early 20th century. He was a well known Freemasonic individual, associated, entrenched deeply in these secret societies. And these secret societies, whether you like them or not, it's the only place from them is the only place that you're actually going to get the last remnant of these traditions that have made it into modern day, right? Secret societies are the ones that preserve the actual rituals and traditions and whatnot. So this work describes, um, if you're familiar with Nabu or with ancient Sumer or Babylon, you might be familiar with the aspect that Nabu, or with the fact that Nabu was brought from Borsippa, his principal seat of worship, up to the Isagila, where he was said to. Well, I don't know. I don't think they've actually given him an attribution of why this happened in mainstream media. They just say that his statue was brought from Borsippa during yearly celebrations and celebrated alongside Marduk. But what John Sebastian Marlowe Ward does is actually expand upon what this tradition was. So if Marduk was played by the king, that of Nabu was enacted by the high priest, and the rest of the worshippers also took part in the dramatic ritual of death and resurrection. The ceremonies covered 12 days, just as did those connected with the Lord of Misrule, Yuletide in England, and the number no doubt refers to the signs of the zodiac months of the year. Um, Coming down here, Nabu came from Borsippa to save his father. In connection with this story, it should be remembered that Nabu is the mason god and had as his emblem the square. Right? And this is confirmed. I've seen this for myself through the tablets and whatnot that are available. In connection, should we remember that Nabu is the mason god, yada, yada, yada. Nabu is similar to Toth, represented Nabu, the mason god. Here he says the king subsequently became accepted as the master instead of Hiram, who became known as the architect. Now Hiram is the god of the masons, right? He's their Hermes. Hiram became known as the architect. The square is the emblem of Nabu, the architect god of the Babylonians. The descent of Nabu to rescue Marduk implies the descent of the just judge to try him, and that the god, having been wrongfully detained, was acquitted and released by Nabu, because that's the intermediary function, right? This is the aspect. He's the son of God, yes, but what that really means is that he is the incarnate Holy Spirit, right? Like this is the motherfucker that makes shit happen. So he descends down. You can even pull this out from this ritual. Like they're saying that Marduk is the king and the dying and rising god. Who is it that's going down to pull his ass out of hell? It's Nabu. He goes down there, judges him as being, oh, you don't belong down here, and pulls his ass out just like that. And this is the Mithraic tradition, because that's what Mithra does. He is the judge, right? He is ultimately the one that the entire cosmic, he rotates the cosmic axis. The war between light and evil, so to speak, revolves around him as the umpire or judge. Okay, so in summation, I think that I've covered just about all that I need to. In summation, Nabu is thought to be the hypostasis, or the character of Nabu being derived directly from the hypostasis of the entire tradition of dying and rising gods. So it's a very deep tradition, but for those who have ears to hear, right? And all that. Okay. Much love.